One. Okay, everybody, welcome back to the Pat Flynn Show. I am excited for the discussion we are about to have, and feel quite privileged to be joined by two men whose work I have both enjoyed very much, Dr. Joshua Swamidass and Dr. Michael Behe. In fact, I have two of their books right here. Sorry, let me hold it in front of the camera. The Genealogical Adam and Eve. Dr. Swamidass, after this conversation, I would love to talk to you about maybe coming back on at another time to talk about that. I think it's an awesome contribution. Dr. Michael Behe's most recent Darwin Devolves, and that will be the primary focus of our conversation today. Before we dive in, Dr. Behe's been on the show a number of times, but and I don't want to spend too much time on this, but just maybe like 2 minutes of introductions, relevant background from each of you, who you are and what you do, and then we can take it from there. Dr. Swamidass, would you mind going first?
Oh, well, thank you. I'm honored. Mike needs no introduction. I'm a lot newer to the scene. I'm a scientist at Washington University in St. Louis. I'm also a medical doctor, but most of my time I spend doing scientific work. Actually, I don't do any medical work anymore. I'm also a Christian, and I follow Jesus, and I find myself as a scientist in the church and a Christian in science. I've written a book that you just pointed to called The Genealogical Adam and Eve, and also founded Peaceful Science, which you can find online. And that's kind of something I do on the side. Really been trying to figure out how to think about theology and faith and science and all of that together in a way that makes sense, that can kind of bring us to a way to make sense of all these things together. I'm also known a bit as a critic of intelligent design. I'd like to see myself as a friendly critic. I have a lot of friends in that movement, but when it comes to some of their scientific points, I've just disagreed with them. And so that's what I hope will make the conversation interesting today.
Right. Yeah. And that's precisely why I wanted to have you on. You're relevant experts, you are a Christian, and you are a friendly critic. And I've obviously I've engaged and read your work, and I think you are the perfect interlocutor for this conversation. So thank you for being here. So Dr. Behe, if you wouldn't mind a brief reintroduction on your end.
Yeah, sure. My name is Mike Behe. I'm a professor of biochemistry at Lehigh University, and I too am a Christian. I'm a Roman Catholic, was born into a Catholic family, and I never concerned myself with evolution or Darwin's theory because Catholics really didn't care about that. People said that Thomas Aquinas had it all figured out a while back. So what did I care? I got interested in evolution though in the mid 80s when I read a skeptical book called Evolution: A Theory in Crisis by a biochemist, geneticist named Michael Denton, who was also a medical doctor too. And he raised a lot of things that I had never heard about in my scientific training, and that startled me. And so I began looking into, I started to look into the question of who had explained all of these complex systems that you routinely come across in biochemistry, and was chagrined to find that nobody had, that essentially everybody was just nodding at each other saying, yes, we understand how this came about. But if you looked in the scientific literature, you would not find that. So at that point, I became interested in evolution, especially in biochemistry, since that's my discipline. And I've written 3 books now over the decades, expressing my doubts about Darwinian theory and my contention that intelligent design is a better explanation for the foundation of life.
Right. Very cool. Okay. So I know we didn't want to make this the focal point of the conversation. I really do want to drill down into the specific empirical disagreements that you two have. But we are coming up on an anniversary of, I guess, something of a
we are in the anniversary of it.
We are. Okay. Would you mind actually giving the brief explanation of that then? Because you're probably more familiar with it than I am.
Yeah. So if we were to go back exactly 15 years from now, we'd be in the middle of arguments for the Dover trial. Mike actually probably has a better handle on precisely where we would be in the proceedings. And they would have ended, I think, November 4th, so sometime next week. Or was it December 4th? About November 4th. And then the judge would have been going into thinking through what his opinion would be, and it would be the end of December that he would deliver the verdict on the Dover trial. This is the Kilmitzer, if I pronounced that right, versus the Dover Kitzmiller versus the Dover Education Board. And we just interviewed Eugenie Scott at Peaceful Science about that. Pretty soon we're going to be interviewing Ken Miller. I asked Mike if he would let me interview him, and he said no, which is a real bummer because we were really wanting to kind of get some views from different sides. Both Ken Miller, who's the author of Miller and Levine biology textbook, and Mike Behe were both star witnesses actually in this trial, and they were really asking, without getting into too many of the messy details, what is going to be the place of ID within high school education. And they decided in a way that very understandingly, a lot of people in the ID movement are going to contest. I'm just trying to explain what happened, right? That wasn't going to work what they wanted to do right then. And so that's kind of the history. That was 15 years ago. I think it was widely appreciated, I think, to be even in the ID movement, to be really not a good thing for ID, and that's not what they wanted to happen. And it's interesting to look at what's happened to the ID movement since then, and maybe even Mike can give us some clues about that as well. How would you add to that story? I tried to be as helpful for people who are new to it as possible without hitting on any of the landmines.
Well, let's see. I would start out by recommending that everybody read a particular book called The Trial, which was written by a man named Franz Kafka. And if you've
that's Kafka. That's not the actual trial.
If you've heard the word Kafkaesque, it's not the Dover trial, but it sure sums up my view of it. Kafka was famous for thinking up these surreal situations where the things appear for no reason, and you don't know what's going on, and that's what I thought of the trial.
I see. That was your experience with it.
You have to realize that courts are not good places to discuss ideas. They are places where lawyers try to win and lose, and lawyers want to paint the other side's witnesses as either fools or knaves or both. I've written a summary of my experience in it, which I sent to Josh in lieu of my appearing on his podcast. And the main point that I make is that there's no evidence that the judge understood any of the academic testimony that was presented at the trial. You have to remember, this opinion was written by an English major from Dickinson University, and who was a lawyer and a failed politician and the appointed head of the Pennsylvania Liquor Control Board. And whenever he wrote about the academic side of the trial, that is about the biochemistry, me and Ken Miller, theology, paleontology, and so on, he copied the text that was handed to him from the lawyers for the plaintiffs, which I don't know for sure, but looking at the phrases, almost certainly was not written by the lawyers, but by Eugenie Scott and her folks.
Can I respond to that?
Not yet, please.
Okay, sure.
National Center for Science Education. And there's so essentially he just signed off what on already was their argument. And there's no evidence to show that he understood any of these concepts. So yeah, it's a legal win, it has force and so on. It's defensible as whether or not a particular idea or a particular school board erred in trying to get something put into the school curriculum. But as an intellectual matter, as some sort of judgment on either Darwinism or design or anything in biology, it has, it has no value.
Yeah, so I know, again, I want to make sure that we don't spend too much time on this because our time is limited. But Josh, definitely want to hear your response to that. And then,
well, first of all, I think it was interesting because I just talked to Eugenie Scott on Saturday, and that's online right now. First of all, I think actually we'd all agree that a legal trial is not the right place to adjudicate scientific issues. I think we'd all agree. And it was interesting. I asked them at the end, Nathan Lentz and Eugenie Scott, if you imagine a world maybe like 10 or 15 years from now, where ID's gotten rid of all its bad arguments and it's actually made a strong case that's solid, that's convinced a large number of scientists, would that prevent it from being taught in high schools? I mean, would that, I mean, like that actual finding? And they actually said, well, I mean, this is kind of like a fantasy world, but if that actually happened, then actually, yeah, that wouldn't stop it. That would actually really help. So I think what they're saying, which I think you're agreeing with, is that actually how scientists see this in the end is going to be far more important than how lawyers see it. That's the first thing. Second thing is, I mean, I've talked to lawyers about this, and it turns out, now this is something that's outside my expertise because I'm not a lawyer. It's outside your expertise too, because you're not a lawyer, but it turns out that it's actually very common for judges to just copy from one of the sides, the side that they're agreeing with. So what they're trying to do is just judge which of the sides they're doing. And a really good written case will have a really good brief given by one side will actually have a lot of quotes. So that's not actually an indication of anything. I wouldn't have known that, honestly, unless I'd actually talked to some lawyers. And we were discussing other cases as well. But you're right, though, because he's not an expert to adjudicate this. But I do think that there's a couple facts that I think you would agree with, Mike. I think you would agree, tell me if I'm right, I think you would agree that the majority of biologists are not on the same page with you on your arguments. They disagree with the argument you made. Do you agree with that?
Yes, of course I do. And I've said so in all of my books.
Yeah.
I pointed out that this is a new idea, and I laid out my argument. So whether they agree with me or not is not the question in my mind.
Yes, I agree.
It's whether they have a response to my arguments or not.
Well,
I haven't
seen
anything.
I'm just trying to focus on the common ground. I think we agree that, and then that fact doesn't mean you're wrong, because maybe everyone else is wrong and you're right. So I'm not making an appeal to authority. I'm just saying as a fact, right, the majority of biologists disagree with you, and we can assess that differently, right? And it does seem to me that if you're going to take, kind of a policy point of view, what should be taught to high school students is what the majority of biologists think. And the best way to change how it's taught is change what the majority of biologists think. And I think actually if maybe in the next 10 or 20 years, if your arguments are as strong as you think about it, Mike, maybe you would convince all of them and that would change everything. So I do think that he was probably qualified and correctly assessed that the majority of biologists disagreed, and that's the case, right?
Well, I think that's a kind of naive, simplistic view. I don't mean any disrespect by that. Scientists not only assess evidence, they have a worldview. They like to look at things in a particular way. And at the trial, although I don't want to talk about this trial, and I don't want to talk about what gets in schools or not, I don't care. Okay. I homeschool my kids. So what do I care? What
yeah. So do I. Yeah. And I definitely want to get to the arguments too. So let's just have one final
talk about whether it's true or not.
Yeah. So let's have one final word on it, and then we'll move on. Mm-hmm.
Okay. The point I want to make is that if you look through the history of science, it's real easy to find a number of places where the entire scientific community thought something was correct and it turned out to be wrong. There's also not too hard to find ideas, new theories that seem to have religious implications. And scientists didn't like them simply because of that. And I talked about the Big Bang theory extensively in the Dover trial to illustrate that point. And because it was not written into the opposing lawyer's document, the judge did not copy that into his opinion. Nonetheless, when the Big Bang theory was first proposed, it seemed to many scientists to smack of creation and so on. And a number of them explicitly said that science needs an eternal universe, and the claim that the universe had a beginning is not scientific. So scientists are not Mr. Spock. They're not just logic machines. And even social aggregations of scientists, scientific organizations, are not just logic machines either. They have their own way that they want the world to be, and they can resist ideas quite strenuously if it goes against what they expect.
Okay, so we are in a relevant anniversary, and that's good that we acknowledge that to begin with. But let's turn to the thing that I think most people are interested in. Is it true, right? Are the critiques? And I understand that intelligent design is sort of an umbrella term, and there's different people hold different criticisms, I suppose. So I want to focus on your work specifically, Dr. Behe, because you're on the podcast. So would you give us just a brief sketch? I know that Dr. Swamidass is familiar with your work, but just for the audience, what is the criticism in a nutshell? And then let's just drill down and dive in from there. Mm-hmm.
Okay, let me just quickly say why we conclude intelligent design. Intelligent design, or something resembling it, was pretty much universally thought to be true before Charles Darwin. And it wasn't a religious conclusion. Rather, people, philosophers, natural philosophers looked at the world and they saw regularity, and they saw really impressive structures, and they looked at the heavens and the stars and so on. And they thought these things are arranged for life on Earth. And it turns out that when we see things that seem to be arranged, that seem to have a purpose, that's when we conclude that, hey, maybe these were purposely done. Maybe these are the result of intelligent design. In 1859, of course, Darwin published his book, Origin of Species, where he said, yeah, that those look designed, but I have a different explanation. I think there's an overlooked natural process that can explain that, and that's random mutation or random variation in natural selection. And that won over people over the years, but in Darwin's time, they didn't know about molecules. They thought the cell was a fairly simple little thing. And since then, science has discovered that the foundation of life, the cell, is enormously complex. It contains very sophisticated machinery and much, much else that I've written about in a couple of my books. And in the meantime, that means that the problem for Darwinism, random mutation and natural selection, has grown larger and larger, because now not only does it have to explain eyeballs and wings and so on, it has to explain this molecular structure of life. And I have written in my books why I think it cannot, and I have used that old argument, the same old argument of the purposeful arrangement of parts, to say, hey, at the foundation of life, there's an incredibly strong purposeful arrangement. So that's the gist of it. As far as I can see, the critique, and of course Josh will correct me here, but the critique is a couple of things. Number one, you're not allowed to invoke design because we say that's not scientific. Number two, in the future, Darwinism will be shown to be able to explain those things, even if it can't now. Or number three, in the future, some other idea will be shown to explain it. Those are the chief ones in my experience.
Okay. So Josh, why don't you come back now? And are there, because just to give people a little bit of background, you co-authored one of the initial published responses, critical responses to Dr. Behe's latest book. So you say that you disagree with his scientific evaluation on certain points. So yeah, why don't you come back now and
yeah, and to be clear, he's written 3 books. I've read both. All 3 of them very closely. So that response was to Darwin Devolves, but what Mike just discussed right now was maybe more closely related to his first book, which I can talk about as well. But let me just start by saying that he talked about the conclusion that he has, that everything's intelligently designed. And I just want to say, in that large conclusion, I actually agree. I share that worldview. I think that, and I would even go farther to say it was divinely designed. I would say that God designed it all. I think that God created us, everything. He did it intentionally, and in that sense, he designed everything. So any of the disagreements we have here are not actually about that conclusion. Mm-hmm. I actually agree with that conclusion. And it's not about worldview, because I'm in that same worldview. The difference really has to do about whether or not the argument being made is sound. And that's the nature of the disagreement here. Because I do actually agree on that ultimate conclusion. And I even publicly articulate that I did that even as a non-tenured scientist. That I think God designed us all. I think he created everything. And so I've been willing to take risks in my career to say that publicly. So that's not what the debate is about. It's not about whether or not God actually designed things. It's rather whether or not the specific argument being made against it makes any sense. Does that clarify a little bit? And I can explain
it does for me. And maybe we could even use me as something of a case study. So Josh, I know this is the first time that we spoke, so I don't assume you know anything about me, nor is it all that interesting. But I was an atheist for a while. And I became a theist predominantly, if not exclusively, because of the philosophical arguments for God and the soul and stuff like that. Evolution was something that I just sort of assumed as part of my educational upbringing. My background is philosophy. It's not science. So I just had no reason to ever really question it, right? When I became a theist, same thing. I saw it as sort of, I had to clear up a few things here. Okay, is this compatible? Especially as I became a Christian with Adam and Eve and stuff like that. And I wish your work was around a little bit sooner. Might have helped me sooner on that question. But yeah, once the worldview switched for me, evolution still wasn't like it wasn't like a big hang up for me, right? Like it just wasn't. And I will say it still isn't in a sense, right? So, and the reason I bring me up is because I just never really took much of a look at the intelligent design movement, even as I was kind of moving from atheism to theism, because it just didn't seem of pressing concern to me. However, curiosity gets the better of me. And especially I start to see we can all be honest, there's been a very vitriolic reaction to a lot of this work. Not all of it, but some of it has been.
To be clear, it's been mutually vitriolic, right? So
yeah,
not every individual person, but there's a lot of animosity from mainstream scientists towards ID.
Right.
There's also a lot of animosity from a lot of ID people towards mainstream science. It's kind of like it's kind of a mutually messy thing. I mean, Mike has largely kind of stayed above the fray, and I also have too.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I want to have you two discuss, because
you have to keep in mind that there are organizations that work to stop intelligent design being discussed, to stop intelligent design books from being published or papers being published. And so while some people in each side might be chill and mellow and others might be vitriolic, it's an uneven, asymmetric battle here, because the organized power, the organized centers are all on the Darwinian side.
So we can circle back to that, because I think that is an important maybe social factor it's worth considering. But the point I'm driving is that as I actually read Dr. Behe's work, and then I read the critiques by Ken Miller or something like that, as a non-specialist, which I admit in that field, I at least came away with the impression of, okay, there's at least something more here than my initial impression was. That there is a case, right? Whether it's an ultimately successful case, I'm not sure, but it definitely wasn't deserving of the hand-waving dismissals that I just assumed by relevant experts was the case before. So I've become I call myself something of a friendly advocate for at least discussion around this. So I guess that kind of situates me in an interesting, maybe makes me somebody who hopefully can moderate discussions like this fairly, just given where I was and how I kind of entered into this. So with that being said, as somebody, for me, Josh, who's read his arguments, who's read the criticisms, where do you think his argument fails? Is like on the empirical level, right? Because I get all the philosophical considerations of the boundaries in science and this and that, and those are important questions. They are. That is good.
I mean, we have to be very clear here. Mike has made several arguments, and I can't really talk about them broadly very well. So we can talk about individual ones. So I'll talk about the one that he's just mentioned here. So first of all, there's actually a large part of what he said that I agree with. So he stated that that he's with his conclusion that everything's designed, and I even went a step further and said I think it's actually designed by God. He doesn't do that in his argument, but I think that is exactly what we should say. Okay, I think he says correctly that.
If I could just say, I don't say that everything is designed. As a matter of fact, I don't think that everything was designed in the fact of being explicitly intended by God. Even though I am a theist, I think there's stuff, there are non-intended side effects of many things. So no, I have run across a number of folks like yourself, Josh, who do think that everything was intended by God. But
no, I didn't say it was everything is intended. So this is getting to theology and like systematic theology. I think we're just struggling with language because we're biologists and not theologians. I'd rather not go down that rabbit trail. I mean, except for to say that I'm just articulating the doctrine of creation, that God created all things. I think that you agree to. Sure. And if that's what we mean by God designed all things, which I think you agree to, so maybe you mean something different and God intended this particular thing. Now let's be clear. I agree with that part. I think it's just a language issue between theology and science we're dealing with. Maybe not, but we can work that out later. The other part that I really agreed with, he says that in general, that when we see the purposeful arrangement of parts, that it seems to indicate design to us. And the way how Doug Axe would put it, which I would agree with, is that it's a design intuition. He's not an ID supporter, but Alan Planigo would call it a design discourse. And I think that there's something that's actually what's so strong about his argument and correct, because it kind of brings you into direct, visual appreciation of the beauty of God's creation, and it's kind of written on our hearts. And Doug Axe would goes much deeper into this, and I think correctly that we just naturally respond to think, oh, this is beautiful, and we worship God with it, right? I think that's completely correct. When we were
right, but that's not at all what I care about.
I know, but I'm telling you the part I agree with.
Okay, well, you can't agree with me on that because I have some significant disagreements with it. You're attributing to me some things I don't actually believe. As I said, I was taught evolution in parochial schools and so on, and I thought that's fine. I did not have any objection to evolution on religious or theological grounds.
Okay.
It was strictly on scientific.
I believe you. I'm just using Christian language and explaining why I agree with the things that you said. You said that we recognize design by purposeful arrangement of parts, and I'm agreeing with you on that. And I'm explaining why I agree with you on that. And the reasons might be different than yours. Is that okay for me to agree with you for different reasons?
Okay, I guess so.
All right. Wow, it's so hard to agree with you, Mike.
Yeah.
All right. So now where does the problem come? So the problem is that how do you break that down into a scientific argument that actually works by the rules of science? And I'm not talking about methodological naturalism. And I'm not even going to bring into the issue about, design versus that, divine design versus that. I mean, I think there's some theological critiques that we made, but we can just leave that all aside. When you get into the details of these arguments, the definitions that are often used are not applied consistently with enough rigor for it to work. Even you take it out of design, like if I made a similar argument having nothing to do with design and used and did those moves in the argument, I'd have a lot of problems. I wouldn't be able to get my paper published. And I know that because I've been I've been struggling to get a lot of papers published over the last 10 years. And so when I look at that, it's before this call, I was on a phone call for an hour actually talking with one of my collaborators, and we were debating what we actually meant by a specific word, because it was creating a great deal of confusion across disciplines. And we needed to make sure that in our argument we were actually applying it in a very consistent way that made sense, and we weren't, and it was creating a lot of confusion, and we were really concerned about this paper.
Okay, could you give a specific example?
And what has happened, I think this has been happening a lot, especially in the irreducible complexity argument, and there certainly came up in Darwin Devolves as well too, is that there ends to be critical concepts that are defined in ways that are not consistently applied,
such as
in ways that really undermine the argument. From an evidential point of view. And as scientists, we're really trained to kind of hone in and understand those.
Can you give an example?
And so that's, let me just finish talking, Mike, I'll let you talk. And so that's kind of where my professional mindset kicks in. I want to know, what is that? And when I've looked over the history of it in several key terms, for example, irreducible complexity, I can show actually how, I saw is a better way to put it, how Mike, very well-meaning, I'm sure, actually shifted definitions over time in a way that, as a scientist trained in academic argumentation like this, it just raised red flags. When I looked into it closer and I tried to make the argument work, I just couldn't, because those shifts end up being really important to making it seem on the surface like a strong argument, but at the lower level, it just isn't. So go ahead. Sorry, Mike. That was just my assessment, and maybe I'm wrong. You can convince me different.
Well, I note in your talk that you didn't refer to any example that I talked about in Darwin's Black Box. You didn't refer to any example I talked about in other books. You just said kind of vaguely that, oh, definitions shifted. You didn't even give the definition. So you haven't actually said anything substantial. In the example in Darwin's Black Box, to get across the idea of irreducible complexity, and like Josh, maybe unlike Pat, I'm not a philosopher. So I write, as precisely as I can. But the definition or the example of irreducible complexity I gave for a broad audience was a mousetrap, a mechanical mousetrap, where you have a wooden base and a spring and a hammer and all these things. And I said, if you take one of the parts away, it doesn't work anymore. And I said that that's a problem for an evolutionary pathway such as Darwin would propose, because because random mutation and selection depends on improving things stepwise in tiny steps. And it's real hard to see how you can make even a simple mousetrap by numerous successive slight modifications, as Darwin in his book, The Origin of Species, demanded. And as a matter of fact, to my satisfaction, nobody has been able to explain even that in the 25 years.
Hey, let's talk about mousetraps. I'd like to talk about the
Okay, in just a second. I'd be happy to. In 25 years, nobody has been able to explain that, let alone the scientific examples I gave. Perhaps the best known of those is, say, the bacterial flagellum, which everyone here knows, but perhaps some of the listeners won't know that it's an outboard motor that bacteria use to swim. And it's phenomenally complex. It's clearly a machine, and it's also irreducibly complex. If you don't have the tail, the propeller, if you don't have the motor, if you don't have a number of different parts, it doesn't work. And it's real hard to see how that could be put together step by gradual step. And what's more, as I reiterate in my newest book, Darwin Devolves, ever since the first book came out, people railed against it, but there has been no progress. There have been no scientific papers published which demonstrate or even come close to demonstrating that random mutation and natural selection could build such an intricate machine. So that's the problem that I want to hear about. That's the critical claim. Darwin's theory, a lot of Darwinists say that the important thing about Darwin's theory is that it showed that design in biology is an illusion.
So I want to respond, but if you put too many things on the table, it just gets confusing. I mean,
yeah, well, okay, please do then.
Put some good ideas out there I'd like to respond to, but if you keep on going, I can't actually, engage. Unless you don't want to, if you want to just kind of, I mean, I'm happy actually if you want to keep on going. There's just 2 points I want to make. And then I want to go back. I mean, there's one point I want to make about that last point you made, and then go back to the very first point about the mousetrap. So first off, I'd actually say that most informed biologists would agree with you that Darwin's theory does not explain what we see. That's actually kind of irrelevant because modern evolutionary science cares about a lot more than just random mutation and natural selection. There's quite a large number of things that are more important. And when we start to think about molecular evolution, there's a lot of non-Darwinian processes that become important. So that type of language, I think, ends up being perhaps well-intentioned, but ultimately misleading because, yeah, we already agree with that point. If that's your point, that's actually been really well established since I think when you were in high school, Mike. So I think that, I mean, I think you were in the high school in the 60s, right?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. So since the 60s, that's actually been very well appreciated by anyone informed about this. So yeah, we agree with that, but that's kind of leaves the entire point beside the point because we don't care about Darwin's theory. We care about how evolutionary science is understood.
So Josh, just for the audience who aren't familiar, what would be an example of something that is a non-Darwinian process?
So there's a large number of things that are non-Darwinian. One example that I've given is neutral processes. So for example, one of the things found out in the 60s, so I'm pointing to Kimura's work. So Haldane, I mean, actually I learned about Haldane and Haldane's dilemma from reading creationist literature and how he said there's not enough time to fix all the changes that we've seen. And to do that, that was a point he made and he was correct mathematically. I heard about the dilemma from creationists, but I didn't hear about the solution until I actually looked at what the literature actually said is, a few years later, Kimura showed that actually the majority of fixation events or how it changes are not caused by selection. They're totally independent of selection, or largely independent is a better way.
And what do they build?
What? Do
they build a flagellum?
That's a different question. I can make a different point. I don't want to change the topic.
That's the question I'm interested
in. So does that single thing explain it? No, it's an interaction of a very large number of mechanisms. But if you are reductive to say, does that one thing explain it? Of course not. There's no one thing that explains it. It's going to be a complex interaction of many things. And if you leave out any one important mechanism, no one would expect to explain it. So to say that I don't think that X plus Y can explain that, when we know that A, B, C, D, E, F, and Z are important too, is kind of like a strange argument to make. I mean, it's a very, very strange argument to make.
Okay.
That's the first thing, but I want to go back to the mousetrap. You put too many things on the table before, okay? So then I think it gives a really good illustration of the point I made about shifting definitions and why this ends up being really critical. So for selection to be an important process, there's got to be some sort of function that's being improved upon. And he's right about that. I already told you that selection isn't the only way things can be made. But if you looked at what he said, he says if you take any one part away, he means the spring, if you take that away, if you take the base away, if you take the trap part of it away, and if you maybe take the trigger part of it away, I don't know. I mean, depending how you make these, maybe it could be like 3 to 5 different parts, right? Then the overall function of the mousetrap stops working. And he's right. But here's where the wiggle word comes in. And I'm not the first person to point this out. Draper is a philosopher who wrote a very long explanation of this. And when Alvin Plantinga, a Christian, read this, this is actually what really changed his view of intelligent design. The point is that each of those individual parts could have had other functions. And actually, biologists have been saying I'm not an expert historian, but I know at least since I was in college, and I think you can even trace this stuff back over 150 years ago to Darwin's book, actually, ironically. But I mean, this has been a constant idea. The word is exaptation. The idea is that part of it might be developed for some reason, and then it gets co-opted, or exapted to be used for another process. And to really be able to tell if something can evolve by evolutionary mechanisms, broadly speaking, you really have to have a comprehensive view of not only its current function, but its past functions. Now, I don't know anyone, frankly, who has not even evolutionists that have a good handle of that on complex cases. Now, I mean, we have some hints and clues into it, but you can't make a strong claim about it's not involved unless you have that handle. So it seems to be then an argument that's really based on either a misunderstanding or a silencing or whatever, or a misuse. I don't know how to explain it. Maybe you can clarify, Mike. I mean, I think it's kind of misleading to give that example when several other people have pointed out this issue of acceptation. You don't have to, just the fact that you take away one part here doesn't mean that it can't evolve. You also have to show that each of the things couldn't have been involved individually, and then come together later. And now you haven't done that with the mousetrap. And that's like a major logical gap that other people have pointed out that when I see that, I just need a way. I'm just explaining to you how I'm responding to it. Okay. Then I'm going to let you say it. When I see that, I've looked very closely at your work on this, and I know what some of your responses are, but I also just heard what your summary was for everyone. And also what you said all the major critiques are. One of the major critiques is acceptation. And I was very surprised to hear that wasn't actually in the list of the 3 things that you raised.
Right. So just to summarize, tried for the non-specialist audience, there might be a process out there where these parts evolve separately, and then somehow, I'm not going to attempt to make a guess of how that would be, they came together and coordinated to serve a different function, right? That's generally kind of what we're discussing.
Yeah, and if you look at how design works, from even how human design.
May I jump in at some point?
We're not designing things from scratch. We start with the things and we put them together. So go ahead.
Yeah. So yes, please, Mike, respond to all that. Yep.
Okay. Josh, I can't believe that you read the work closely, because I addressed all those issues, starting from Darwin's black box, in each of my books, and in blog posts, papers, and all sorts of other things besides. So when you say that you don't understand how I can give this example, how can you object to it if you haven't read my responses?
I did read your work.
What I said is I objected to how you presented it
here. I said I objected how you presented it here.
In Darwin's black box, I says, okay, well, suppose you want to make something like a mousetrap, and so you go into the garage, and here's a tire iron that maybe you'll use as the holding bar, and here's a spring from a grandfather clock. Maybe you can use that as the spring for the mousetrap. And I said, but it's clear that you can't use those parts unless they are matched to each other. So saying that this one part arose for some other purpose, and yet we can use it for some other complex purpose without adjusting it, is not a serious proposal. I also wrote that we don't have to talk abstractly about these things. A lot of evolutionary experiments have been done in the past 25 years or so. For example, my second book was about the development of chloroquine resistance to malaria. And I don't have time to get into the specifics, but there was an enormous number of malaria parasites in the world, an astronomical number, 10 to the 20th or more. Many, many, many more than the number of, say, vertebrates that exist in the world. And yet, when they were challenged with this lethal drug, chloroquine, they could have done anything they wanted to. They could have, exapted something. They could have duplicated some genes. They could do anything. And yet, at the end, when people determined how they had developed resistance to this drug, chloroquine, there were 2 little point mutations in a pre-existing protein. More recently, I talk in my book about experimental laboratory evolution, and almost uniformly, I should say uniformly, it's due to either the breaking or rearranging of pre-existing genes. There's no acceptation to make something new, certainly nothing of the complexity of the systems that I talked about.
But isn't rearranging existing stuff to make something new, isn't that actually literally the definition of acceptation? How is that not acceptation?
Well, there is no example. The only example that is
you said rearranging. I'm just confused on a language level. I mean, I'm honestly confused. You said nothing except for breaking or rearrangement of existing parts, but rearrangement is acceptation.
No, it isn't. Acceptation.
Okay, what's the difference?
Acceptation means you use, say, the spring from the grandfather clock in your garage.
Rearrange it from the grandfather clock into this new
as
thing.
the spring for the mousetrap. You can't say it's acceptation if you have to take something or something that looks like something else and extensively modify it to get it to work. So,
really?
for example,
okay, I'm not familiar with this definition.
Well, read the books.
I've read the books very closely. I'm a biologist who's studied evolutionary science very closely.
In any event, in the best laboratory evolution experiment that was done, no new molecular machines were seen in Richard Lenski's experiments with E. coli. As a matter of fact, the overwhelming number of mutations broke pre-existing genes, and that helped. And let me just add just one more point, and then I'll turn over the microphone. Josh says that, most biologists know that Darwin's theory, Darwin's mechanism isn't the only thing. I certainly know that too, but his two co-authors of my book, of the review of my book that appeared in Science magazine,
Nathan Lentz and Richard Lenski.
Yes, argues strongly for Darwinian principles. Richard Lenski is a very strong Darwinist. So there are, and I disagree with Josh. I think the majority of biologists, when they think of evolution, think of Darwinian processes. There are some who don't, but they haven't much made their case either.
I mean, that's interesting. I mean, Nathan's a good friend of mine, actually. We've talked about this lessons. I also talked to Lenski about it too, but they know how I see this, and they didn't actually have any scientific objections to what I was saying. I mean, maybe it's just different ways of expressing the same idea. I don't know. But I mean, we can let go of the precise term acceptation. You're saying that new functions can be arise out of rearranging existing parts. So if that's what you think, I mean, that's what I mean when I say acceptation. And so that's pretty interesting that you think that can happen too.
But not by chance, not without purposeful direction. I mean, if you're talking about rearranging, say, bones from a leg into bones for a flipper, which was one of the examples that you and your co-authors used in the review of my book, you can't say that these bones were just exapted and hey, now they're a flipper. There's lots and lots of things, intermediate steps, including lots and lots of molecular steps, which would have to take place. It strikes me that the phrase acceptation is being used as a magic wand. It sounds like
that you're kind of making the case for the evolutionists, though, because you're saying that there's a lot of intermediates that would be there. So if there's a lot of intermediates between point A and point B, that actually makes the story more plausible.
I'm not sure
So yeah, maybe I can just jump in here, just because I can see the initial plausibility of saying, well, hey, yeah, we have these different parts and maybe they could come together and coordinate to a new function. Now, I'll be honest, that does sound a little bit magical to me. Again, I'm a layman, so I'm not saying that that's an argument against it, but that would be pretty fantastic. However, once I'm not a molecular biologist, but when I've read the work and I've seen the examples of these molecular machines, they're not the type of thing. Let me say it this way: they seem very efficient. And correct me if I'm wrong there, but they seem very well.
Not all of them, but some of them are.
Right. And if the process were really something of grabbing this part and this part that wasn't originally intended to coordinate to some larger thing, I would probably expect not things that are quite efficient, right?
Also,
Like
what I
maybe
would say is that
clunky
you're
or
working from like a particular model in mind, but I'd say biology is somewhat that, but it's also something else too. Like another word picture to throw in there would be something like Legos. So and it's not a perfect analogy, but let me just give you some evidence behind that. Like if you look at chimpanzees and humans, we have essentially the same pieces. There's slightly different interaction networks. There's slightly different point mutations. Mike even agrees that there's no molecular machines that humans have that chimpanzees don't, and that there's no
but that doesn't explain where they came from.
Biochemical evidence.
But that doesn't explain where they came from. Even if you're using that to try to argue for common descent between chimps and humans, I don't care about common descent.
But that's I
only care about whether the molecular machinery required purposeful design or not.
No, that I didn't. This isn't the argument against purpose. This is rather making the statement that all the differences between us and chimpanzees, to first approximation, that's not the complete story, but it's a very big part of the story, is just, slight rearrangement of parts. And that creates a very large difference between us and them. And I think God was involved in human evolution. So I'm not saying it's not purposeful and God didn't do it. I'm just saying that quite a bit can be done, stuff that we wouldn't expect. And it fits a little bit more the Lego analogy in that case. That's all I'm saying. It's a limited point. It's not an argument against God's involvement. That would be silly because I'm not arguing against God's involvement.
All right, let me just make two short points. The Lego analogy I really like, but you have to realize that Legos are put together by intelligent agents. They don't assemble themselves. The second thing is that you think that God was involved with the development of humans. How would you convince Nathan Lentz, your co-author on the review of my book, that that's a reasonable conclusion?
I'd start by agreeing with you. All three of us are in agreement that there is no biochemical case to be made for design in human evolution. All three of us agree with that. I would also agree, you see evidence for common descent from chimpanzees. We all agree with you. You, me, and him all agree. So how am I going to make the case that was God involved? Well, I would want to make that case. But let me just start with that common ground. That common ground builds a lot of trust. I hope I'm not misrepresenting you, but I think you actually agree with me on that. I mean, most of your evidence comes from bacterial systems and, yeast systems and, malaria and all that. But in human evolution, you don't think that you can actually look and tell. So, but that doesn't mean God wasn't there and God didn't do something, right? It just means that those arguments are harder to make when you're looking at that distinction.
I understand. Yeah, and I addressed that specifically in Edge of Evolution.
Yes, this is a point like major common ground, man. So let me agree with you. All right.
I said that there aren't any biochemical, but there certainly are behavioral and intellectual profound differences between people and primates. And that I said that some of these differences are also mystery. There's no reason to think that Darwinian processes or other unguided, non-intelligent
You're not even letting me agree with you, and I'm trying. You asked me how to convince him. You're going off to something else. You're telling me how your point of view. You want me to know how I'm going to convince him. So I'm telling you, like, that's a massive place of common ground that you actually have with Nathan Lentz, and I have with him too. Okay. And so, let's just start with that common ground. And the next thing I would do is tell him the exact way I came to believe that. I would tell him that I encountered Jesus, saw the evidence that he rose from the dead. I came to believe and trust him. I came to trust scripture when I see what scripture teaches about humans. And it seems to make a great deal of sense that God is involved. When you look at how different we are from other animals, even though we're so continuous with them, that paradox is a puzzle that has to be worked out. And, this is something that scientists have been grappling with for a long time. And I think there are evolutionary accounts of it, but I'm not satisfied that any of them are the whole story. And so I don't have to disagree with any of those evolutionary accounts to say that maybe there's more to it. And that's essentially, your position, Mike. And I think that's a strong position.
I don't think we have the same position. I am looking for physical, biological evidence that some transformation or some
What's your case that humans are designed?
biological feature required purposeful design. I don't think you're doing that. What feature between chimps and humans would you tell Nathan Lentz led you to believe that God was involved in making one from the other?
Well, I think I'm using evidence in a different way, because I can definitely point to very suggestive pieces of evidences about our differences. I think humans are, exceptional, or, I don't want to say unique precisely, but there's something very different about us, and a very, it's a way it's hard to characterize, like what it means to be human. I don't think if aliens came to Earth, they would be wondering, well, what does it mean to be a dog? I think they'd be wondering, like, what's different about humans. They're not going to be wondering about what's different about cows or all that. They're going to be wondering about what's different about humans. I think that's objective. I think it's a little bit hard for scientists to appreciate that. He's written a book called Not So Different, where he gets into how we're very similar. And I would actually agree. We are far more similar than most people realize, but we're also far more different. And, language is a great example of that. You're a Catholic, you talk about the rational soul. That's a very solid reason. There's something that's happened. Even Chomsky, who was not a Christian, really argued that there had to be a large step change in our language capacity. All that's there. Now, none of that proves that evolutionary mechanisms couldn't do it. But what we do know is that we have an N of 1. N of 1 is a statement that we say as scientists, where we just have one example of a species. If you look at great apes, we all started out at about the same place. And there's maybe like 4 species of, apes/humans alive today. And
well,
I just anything with human condition. That
disagree.
Should be a puzzle.
The final chapter of my last book, Darwin Devolves, was exactly about the differences in intelligence, in rationality, and so on between humans and other creatures. And I argued explicitly, I'm sure you remember, that Darwinism can't account for that. And if you deny you have a real mind, as many Darwinists
let's just slow down a bit to say,
then you lose your grip on reality.
But let me just.
So I just want to mention that I have considered all of these topics, and
but look, I just want to
come to different
that
conclusions.
This is a strong philosophical argument to consider, or like a suggestive thing, but it's not actually an airtight scientific argument. There's particular rules in science, and this doesn't actually satisfy it. It's an N of 1, like I said, and I don't think that that's a problem. I just think it's something that God's put there that's just a puzzle for us to figure out. I don't think science can give a complete answer to this question.
So just I'm sorry, finish your thought, Josh, and then I'll.
I don't think it can give a complete answer. I think that to say that all of its answers are inadequate may be true, but it's also true that there's legitimacy to some of the answers it's given. So, for example, like Behe and I would both agree, Mike would agree that we share common ancestry with the great apes. That's part of the story. There's legitimacy to that, even though I think both Mike and I would agree, and I think even Nathan Lentz would agree that that's not the whole story. And so we're kind of left really with a grand mystery that we're trying to figure out. And is God in that mystery? I think he's not just in the mystery, he's also in the reality that we found. I think there's something very suggestive that God was involved.
Well, I try to restrict myself just to the biology. And as I've explained in books and articles, I think common descent is true, but I think common descent is trivial, because all it says is that some ancestor in the past had some traits, and now some descendants have it, maybe even different kinds of descendants. But it doesn't say where it came from, and it doesn't say how fantastic changes might have occurred in descending species. And that's particularly true with humans. Hey, maybe we have a lot of biochemical pathways and other things in common with other primates, but that doesn't explain where they came from in the first place. And it doesn't explain how humans have come to be the only rational species, the only thinking species, the only species with a real mind on the planet. So it really doesn't say anything at all.
Well, I mean, I wouldn't say anything, but I would say I would agree. Look, let's just be say there's like two extremes. It doesn't say anything, it's not adequate to explain. So it does say something about it. It does not explain everything. Okay, I think that seems to be a very self-evident reality. It does not explain everything. Anyone who says that evolution explains all of this is not correct. To say that it doesn't explain anything is just about as extreme.
There are a large number of biologists, including, well, I don't want, but there are a large number of prominent biologists who would say, or who would lead the public to believe that in fact evolution, or in particular Darwinian unguided, unintelligent processes,
I would just say that that's not
to explain all of life.
I mean, depending on exactly what's being said, but if they're saying that evolution explains everything, that's not correct. I don't think the answer is to make another false claim.
Right.
Look, another way, the really good analogy that I heard from one of my friends at Peaceful Science, who's a scientist, is that, we all believe that, the American Revolution occurred, but we can't retrace the steps of every single soldier along the way. Because so when we talk about the history of the American Revolution, it's not a total history. It's only part of the story. It doesn't give us fine-grained detail, and we can generate, large places of large amounts of information. We can draw attention to that by just asking detailed questions. And, in the end, we can't really rule out that God wasn't walking among the soldiers. Like, we can't rule out a lot of things that God was doing because we just have such a limited view of the past. And I think you take that analogy, and I think it actually works really well to explain the gaps in our biological knowledge in the past, where we can get some view about where things have happened, but we don't really know how a lot of it happened at the fine-grained detail of knowing how soldiers, walked the paths during the American Revolution, I think order of mutations and things like that.
I think that's why Darwinism is such an impediment to science. Because people say, hey, we don't know how something happened in the past. It's really complicated. So we'll just assume that.
No. That's not what we do. What we say is, now we're going to form theories about it happened and test it.
By the way, and when we do go to test it, we have to test it at the molecular level, because unlike Darwin, we now know that genetic information is encoded in a molecule, and the molecular machinery is the foundational level of life. And there is no experiment that shows undirected processes can do anything like building the molecular foundation of life.
I mean, I don't know why I call you Behe, Mike. It's because your name is common and your last name is Behe. I'm sorry, I mean no disrespect. But Mike, here's the thing. I mean, there's no scientific way to even tell if a process is directed or not. So if we produced I don't know how to tell if God directed the process in my experiment or not. There's no way to do that. In the way how you represent, this is actually something that I believed when I first read your book, but then I actually spent time with biologists and actually started to spend time and I found out it just wasn't true. Isn't that okay? Because it could happen, we don't care and we're just going to accept it. What they do is they start proposing different hypotheses and testing them, and it gets really interesting. And that's what I've really enjoyed, honestly, about studying evolutionary science literature. Not because I think evolution can explain everything, but because by that hypothesis testing approach, they're revealing parts of how God created. They're certainly never going to explain everything. I wouldn't expect anyone to be able to explain everything. That's like expecting God-like omniscience from this very limited human effort. And, as I understood it, what science really was showing us and how limited it really was, I came to see how actually all the people you're critiquing, Mike, about who have gone out publicly and overstated the claims of evolution, I actually agree with you on that. I think they have overstated it. I just, instead of rather making the extreme argument in the opposite way, I'd rather just kind of be more, kind of take the part that actually acknowledges the legitimacy of both sides, and maybe also kind of acknowledges kind of how both sides have overstepped, and maybe more true to where the evidence is really telling us in a limited way.
So yeah, let me hop in here real quick, because even what you just said, Josh, would have been very surprising to me a while ago, because I was under that assumption that it's taken care of. It is explained. Again, not being a biology major, but having taken my biology courses in high school and stuff like that, that was the general impression that I had no reason to really question it. I'm not saying that's everybody's impression, but that was mine. Right. Now, I'm not saying your position is unreasonable, but we don't have to name names for people who aren't here to
Well, I
defend
would also
themselves.
just point out my view is not controversial.
Yeah, or controversial. I'm not saying that, but without naming names, there are popular level authors who do continue to give that impression, right, on the Darwinian paradigm, right? And I think we all agree on that. But it's important for my audience who might not have a dog in this fight. This is the first time they've heard any type of thing on, who might have had a similar impression as me of the science is settled. If you even question any aspect of this, you're either extremely ignorant or insane. That type of rhetoric, right? Now, I know we're running out of time here, so if we have to cut this off, we can just close the final thoughts. But arguments for conscious, very interesting, from intentionality and things like that. I think they're great. I think they work. That's what convinced me. But Mike has insisted that his case is an empirical case. It's not a case from philosophy, nature, or something like that. And that you would argue, and correct me if I'm wrong here, Mike, that the best of the empirical evidence we have right now counts against the, would you say, mainstream Darwinian understanding? Is that fair to say? And then,
yes.
And then
maybe just say mainstream account instead of mainstream Darwinian, because we wouldn't agree with Darwinian.
Mainstream account. I'm fine with that. The mainstream account,
but the mainstream account is Darwinian.
I disagree.
Put the terminology aside. I don't think that's going to hang us up here. Where is he without getting, and we covered exaptation. You two went back and forth on that. I guess what I would expect is if the mainstream account was more robust, I guess what I would expect is more of a refutation, if I'm just being honest. And I'm not saying there isn't a refutation. I'm just saying from my initial impressions and reading the work and going back and forth through critiques, I have to say I'm frequently underwhelmed by the responses of people to Mike's arguments or stuff like that I feel like should be able to bury this thing, quite frankly. If there are,
have you read Draper's response?
I have, yeah. I have Draper. He's a philosopher I very much respect.
Have you read Flanagan's response?
So Flanagan, where
William Craig's response and why he disagrees.
I don't think Craig does disagree. He does. I mean, not with Behe's, from what I remember, and in where the conflict.
Josh, have you read my response to Draper?
Yeah, of course I have.
Okay.
And not only that, I'm just telling you.
But hold on, real quick. Let me finish my point real quick, because the last thing I read from Flanagan on it was in where the conflict really lies. Has there been something more recent from that on Flanagan?
No, that's what I'm talking about. I'm also talking about Bill Craig stuff. He recently published a Peaceful Science about this. I mean, I think that it was on EPS meeting 2 years ago. He explained where he disagreed. Like, I think that I'm just telling you that there are, this is a big public debate where there's a lot of uninformed people engaged. There's also a lot of experts that are pissed off and throwing snipes at one another that are not informed. Okay. I don't think that any of that stuff really matters. Like, frankly, even if everyone hates ID, but they make a solid argument, I think ultimately they're going to win the day. Yeah. And what really matters is the scientists that have respectfully engaged with them. And I think that, you have to actually be able to filter through a lot of really bad responses to find the good ones.
Oh, I certainly agree with that. And that's why I look to people, not just like Flanagan, but Draper, right?
So for example, I would be really curious to hear what you think about the short series I wrote about, about irreducible complexity and how that addresses it. I can give you the link to that afterwards. Maybe you can post it alongside that. I've asked Mike to respond to it, but he hasn't. I mean, maybe he will, but I'd be really curious to hear how you read that. I mean, I wrote it to be understandable to someone just like you.
Right. I haven't read that yet, so I'm not going to speak on it, but I will link it. Mike, I don't know if you wanted to offer any remarks about that now or.
Yeah, I do. It's that the machinery that I discussed in Darwin's black box is really, really impressive, the flagellum and so on. But people like Draper and like Flanagan and others took it to be a philosophical argument, saying you can't rule out a pathway by which we can, put this thing over there and come over and end up with this. It's supposed to be a scientific argument that this is not a good explanation for the complex machinery we got. In my most recent book, Edge of Evolution, I reduced the complexity down to the tiniest example of cooperation between some biochemical parts that we can. A technical term, it's called a disulfide bond. And I ask, how do you get just a disulfide bond to evolve where it wasn't before, where maybe it might do some good? And I showed that evolutionists, Darwinists, a guy named Eugene Koonin is a prominent scientist, don't have a clue how even such a small cooperative thing could have evolved. And in my book, I also make up a new principle that I call the principle of comparative difficulty. And that says that if one thing is too hard to do, if an easier thing is too hard to do, then a harder thing is certainly going to be too hard to do. If somebody can only jump 3 feet high, given his best effort, you'd be foolish to bet money that he could jump 6 feet high on the next time. So Darwinists and the consensus view that that is
I'm a computational biologist.
hear, just a sec,
is applying math to biology.
That you often hear.
For a living is applied math.
All right, hold on. Let's let Mike finish, and then Josh, we'll give you time to respond. Mm-hmm.
Essentially, it's bluster. It's all bluster. Nobody can explain the flagellum. Nobody can explain anything simpler than a flagellum. Whenever there is anything that requires cooperative interactions, that's where Darwinism and frankly all these other evolutionary mechanisms that Josh thinks is important, that's where they all fail. I try to keep the focus on that in my book, but if Darwinists, if evolutionary biologists can't explain how a disulfide bond could arise, they can't explain pretty much anything of the molecular machinery of life.
Okay. Well, I know we're already over time. So
I'm going to be very, very brief, and then we got to probably end.
Yeah, and then we'll do final thoughts. Yeah, thank you. Yep.
I'll just be very, very brief here. I mean, I think that's really exciting what you said, honestly, Mike, because it turns out that, I'm a mathematical biologist. I'm a computational biologist. I learned how to do this. And what's going on here is actually just a misunderstanding on the math. And it turns out that these are actually really understandable. We can actually directly observe some of this stuff in actual experiments. And there's something called the birthday paradox, which is kind of that's where the math went wrong in your stuff. So it's the same thing that just arises on how likely it is that there's 2 people in the same room that have the same birthday. And so these sorts of things, like, they're very subtle. I mean, I'm not saying that you're being dishonest. Like, honestly, if you're not trained the way I was, you would just miss these things. And they're the sort of thing that maybe even Koonin misses, because like he's not a computational biologist already. And there's ways to actually make sense of this. You just may not be familiar with that literature, and that's okay. I'm happy to get into that. And I think that's actually what's been the most exciting and what has kept me engaged in this conversation for so long, about how, it ends up pointing to really interesting science in that. And that's the part that I don't want to miss out on. Go ahead. You can kind of give us, and that could be my last thought, actually. How about that? You want to have the last thought, Mike?
Yes. So let's final thoughts here, and we'll wrap this up, and I'll make sure we also get to mention all the other work that you guys do before we say goodbye. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, just tell the listeners that, as you might expect, I don't agree with Josh in very, very many things. He doesn't agree with me. So I would encourage everybody to read for yourself these arguments and come to your own conclusions. As I've said before, it's been a case a number of times in the history of science that the entire scientific establishment has been wrong. This is another case where they are wrong. And I try to present the evidence as clearly as I can, and I try to rebut the objections as clearly as I can. I actually have a new book coming out in a month or so called A Mousetrap for Darwin, which collects all of my responses to critics such as Josh and other people over the years. So if you're interested in my take on the nitty-gritty of all this, that'd be a good place to start.
Okay. Well, I want to thank both. This has been a spirited discussion, but I think it's been a fruitful discussion. And,
did you learn anything?
Yeah. Hey, I seriously, honestly, that's why I have you on. I think me, along with, my listeners, that's why we have these discussions. We just want to know what's true at the end of the day. Right. And, that's, if nothing else, I just feel like these discussions deserve to, be discussed. And I want to get people who I think can represent both sides intelligently and charitably. So I want to thank you both for doing that. And I like energy. I like a little spirit and passion in it. So I thank you both for bringing that as well.
Yeah, thank you, Mike.
I'd love if we could all go out for a beer, or
I'd older than me, and you're it's a privilege for you to talk to me. I'm really glad we were able to talk about this.
And so before we go, I want to make sure, Josh, if you wouldn't mind, maybe just giving a brief rundown of this book, and then, like I said, I'd love to schedule a time maybe for you to come back on, and we could just talk about that.
Sure. So you're talking about the Genealogical Adam and Eve.
I am. Sorry, I lost the jacket. It doesn't look as pretty as
I'm, Mike, have you read it yet? Would you be willing to take a read? I've read 3 of your books, so you read one of mine.
I'd be happy to read it. I'm sorry I haven't done so yet, but I will.
All right. So do me a favor. Would you read it and like post an article at EMV or let me know? I'd love to know. Would you promise me to do that?
Yeah, I will do.
I think you might agree with me on some things. He says we disagree a lot, but we agree a lot. I mean, I think this book shows how consistent with mainstream science without having to challenge it. I mean, you can challenge it too if you want to. It doesn't require you to accept it, but consistent with mainstream science, consistent with the idea that we share common descent with the great apes. Adam and Eve could have been specially created as recently as just 6,000 years ago, and they'd be ancestors of all of us. They could have been, created without parents. All that would, and it ends up to be actually, essentially, like the traditional de novo account of Adam and Eve that your grandmother would have believed in Genesis, and that's actually not in conflict with Genesis. And I think that's important because look, scientists are going to have controversy. Mike and I are going to debate about this probably till he dies, and that's okay.
Me. Why do you say me and not say you?
Oh, you and I together will fight with each other about this stuff because scientists argue. But the fact of the matter is that we don't have to worry about that as people who follow Jesus and take scripture seriously. There isn't really the same sort of things at stake that we've thought. And I think that's why this ends up becoming important. It can become a conversation we participate in for the fun of it, to see what science leads us, not because there's actually a threat to how we read scripture.
Right. Yeah. It's so excellent. I'm going to link that in the show notes as well. I know it wasn't the theme of our discussion, but I want to encourage people to grab that. Sorry, I keep forgetting where my camera is at. Dr. Behe's latest, Darwin Devolves, right? I terrible. I keep losing the jackets, all these books, because I spend so much time with them. That's why.
So folks can recognize it in the bookstore here.
Yeah. So I will link that in the show notes. I'll link anything else that either of you two want me to put in the show notes as well.
You got to put it in print that Mike agreed to read my book and give a comment on it.
And who knows? Maybe we can have.
No, see it, man. I really loved your first book, man. I was in college. It really opened my eyes to a lot of things, and that's part of what put me on the path that I'm here right now. It would mean a lot to me if you did, Mike.
Great. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you both so much. Really appreciate it. And gentle listeners, give us your feedback. Leave a comment, share this episode. We want to encourage more of these dialogues here on the Pat Flynn Show. So thanks again to both of my wonderful guests, and thank you for listening. Take care.
Okay. Bye-bye.